Parker was an extremely charismatic, interesting fellow, and probably one of the most ferocious warriors on the plains. He was last chief of the Comanche Nation, and the really great thing about this experience, as we were involved in the project to try to analyze the Star House, was at the end of the process when they presented the report. I got to meet 300 of his direct descendants, which was fantastic. He was a true leader, and people recognized that. People that would meet him would recognize that. And, he was, he had people that came to the Star House, presidents and that type of thing, to welcomed him as the leader of the nation. And just truly, I think it was just his presence, that really impressed so many people. The story goes, from what I understand, Quanah Parker, who at the time was, met with many of the generals at the base and that type of thing, and thought that, if they have stars, I should be able to have some stars. And so I think that's how they got painted on the house. I cannot tell you why they're upside down and why they were as I understand it, they actually were painted on the original wood shingles as well. And you could still see some evidence that they faded out, of course, over time, but it's still there. So, and a very interesting feature, and had it not been for those stars, it wouldn't have the great name that it has today. The house was passed down, and of course its original location was on the Fort Sill Military Reservation, that eventually the home site was absorbed into their gunnery range. And so that's what necessitated the move. And the house at the time that it was moved, I think that was in 1958, was actually Miss Birdsong's property. And she's one of the, I think a granddaughter, of Quanah, passed down through the years the property to her. And the interesting thing was, when Fort Sill actually decided to move the house, they were supposed to move it and set it up with utilities and that type of thing. What we found out was it was actually moved just off the reservation onto a plot of ground, and after 2 years, the utilities were never hooked up to it. So Miss Birdsong, of course, couldn't live under those conditions, so she made a deal with a gentleman in Cache. I believe his name was Mr. Gibson, and he offered to take possession of the house and buy her a house in town. And so that transacted. So at that time, the property actually went out of the control of the Comanche Nation. Anyway, so the property went to Mr. Gibson's family. They moved it to the property. And I think it was Eagle Park, if I remember, was the name of the property. And they had already acquired a number of historic facilities, so it made sense, for this property to be there. Here in the middle of the field next to Cache Creek is where Star House sets. And we actually came into the picture because we'd had a series of flooding, much like we've just had, and the house actually had 3 feet of water in the property. It was just set low to the ground on cinder blocks. And so we were recruited by Preservation Oklahoma and the National Trust to come in and try to figure out a stabilization plan for the house. The complication being, with the property not being in tribal ownership, how that was going to work, how they were actually be able to fund the restorations and transfer the ownership. Were they going to just elevate the house? Were they going to move it to another property? All those kind of things came into play. And so as we got involved in the property and trying to figure out what to do with it and how to stabilize it, very quickly we kind of analyzed that, okay, we have to take the home and figure out how to take it down to its very original kernel. The home, when it was moved off of the reservation, actually from the site that was just off the reservation into this Cache amusement park, was set on concrete block foundations. And so part of our task was to recruit a structural engineer to kind of investigate that. And what we did find out was, through some excavation and some input from the structural engineer, it actually was constructed to set within residential building code standards as it sat there. It just never was hooked back up to utilities or anything like that. Part of the task was trying to figure out how to actually stabilize the house. One of the things that you immediately found when you started investigating the house, you could walk in the front door and see out the upper roof. And so obviously the safety of workers, just being able to stabilize and cocoon it enough to be able to do whatever modifications were needed to do the stabilization effort was pretty tricky. It was really difficult to tell on those peripheral areas what was original and what wasn't original, because the property had just been repaired so many times through its life, and being wood exposed to the elements, all the woods had aged, and so a lot of the keys were just looking at the stamps on the different materials and things like that you could tell what was new, what was old, and that type of thing. The property was just so exposed to the elements, and probably after 1958 received very little care. So just the ravages of weather will just take a very high toll on that. And with, we did this study back in 2015, and so if nothing was done to kind of salvage the deterioration of the roof that allowed all the weather to come in, it's just probably had a devastating impact on it. But what we did find actually was on the basic structure of the house was still fairly sound. All of the interior floorboards and the decking and things like that on the roof needed to be replaced to be sound and safe. The very first process was to cocoon it, and we needed to get the roof closed in. That needed to be priority one, was to rebuild the roof and that type of thing. And so the other thing that added to it would allow us to actually solid sheathe the roofing that would give more stability to the roof than a slatted type decking that you use for wood shingles. And so we actually analyzed the property with the constructability manager, and his recommendation was, after discussions on how dangerous it was to try to just do the roof because you couldn't really load bear off of anything, we figured out a method to be able to scaffold actually up off the ground inside the house, remove some interior flooring boards and that type of thing, and be able to get up and actually work on the roof structure, get it back stabilized, and then once you did that, you work back down from the roof down to stabilize the rest of the property. If you read the book on his life, you understand, his great impact on the Comanche Nation, all of those aspects, but the great impact on the interaction with the world that was around them at the time. And it's indeed the type of property that cannot be experienced from pictures. You have to actually physically be in the property to really experience and know that you're standing in the same place that Quanah Parker stood, all those years ago. And once it's gone, it's a story that will lose so much of its character with people not being able to experience just the wonder of the place, that you can't experience any other way than just being there. So.